Hello! Welcome. Welcome. Sunday night, Monday morning, Monday afternoon. It's a time zone for you.
My fiancée slept with my brother, then claimed I hit her. I spent 6 months in jail until his ex showed me the proof. I sued her and won everything. So there I was, 3 weeks before my wedding, thinking life couldn't get any better. I had this amazing fiancée named Victoria who worked as a nurse at the local hospital. Beautiful woman, smart as hell, and everyone loved her. My family treated her like she was already family, especially my older brother Lucas who worked construction and lived about 20 minutes away from us. Victoria and I had been together for 4 years, engaged for 8 months. We had this nice little house we were buying together, 2 cars, good jobs, the whole American dream package. She was always talking about kids and how she wanted to be the perfect wife. I believed every word because why wouldn't I? The woman was planning our honeymoon to Italy and showing me wedding cake samples every other day. But then strange things started happening around the 6-week mark before the wedding. Victoria would get text messages at weird hours and quickly flip her phone over when I walked into the room. She started working extra shifts at the hospital, coming home exhausted and not wanting to talk much. When I asked about it, she said they were short-staffed and she needed the overtime money for the wedding expenses. The first real red flag came when I surprised her at the hospital one evening with dinner from her favorite restaurant. The charge nurse told me Victoria had left 3 hours earlier, but Victoria didn't come home until midnight. When I asked where she'd been, she got defensive and said she'd gone shopping for wedding stuff and lost track of time. But she didn't have any shopping bags and her story kept changing every time I asked for details. Lucas had been acting weird too. My brother who used to call me every few days suddenly became this guy who barely returned my calls. When he did show up for family dinners, he wouldn't look me in the eye and kept making excuses to leave early. Mom kept asking what was wrong with him, but I figured he was just stressed about work or maybe having problems with his girlfriend Amy who he'd been dating for about a year. Then I started noticing little things around the house that didn't make sense. Victoria's work schedule written on our kitchen calendar didn't match the shifts she was actually working. She told me she was working Tuesday night, but when I called the hospital looking for her, they said she wasn't scheduled. When I confronted her about it, she said the schedules were always changing and she forgot to update the calendar. The real kicker came 2 weeks before the wedding when I found a receipt in Victoria's purse for a hotel room. Not just any hotel room, but the fancy place downtown that cost $300 a night. When I asked her about it, she said her coworker had booked it for her bachelorette party planning committee to meet and discuss details. But the receipt was dated for a Tuesday afternoon, and it was just for one night, not a meeting. Victoria started picking fights over nothing after that. The flowers weren't right, the caterer was incompetent, I wasn't helping enough with the planning. She was crying all the time and saying maybe we should postpone everything. I thought it was just wedding stress because that's what everyone told me. Even my mom said all brides go crazy before their big day, but this felt different. Then Lucas showed up at our house one evening when Victoria was supposedly at work. He looked like he hadn't slept in days and kept pacing around our living room like a caged animal. He said he needed to tell me something important, but every time he started talking, he'd stop and say never mind. He kept asking where Victoria was, which I thought was strange because he'd never shown much interest in her whereabouts before. Finally, Lucas just hugged me and said he was sorry about everything and that he hoped I'd understand someday. He also mentioned something weird about how Victoria wasn't the person I thought she was, but when I pressed him for details, he clammed up and left. I had no idea what he was talking about, but looking back now, the poor bastard was probably trying to confess and couldn't find the courage. I called him the next day, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When I drove by his apartment, his truck wasn't there, and his neighbor said he hadn't seen Lucas in 2 days. This was completely unlike my brother, who was usually reliable about staying in touch with family. Victoria came home that night acting completely different. She was sweet again, making dinner, talking about our future, acting like the woman I fell in love with. I thought whatever crisis we were having was over. She even suggested we move up our wedding date because she couldn't wait to be my wife. She was being extra affectionate, wanting to have sex more often, telling me how much she loved me every few hours. Looking back, this was classic guilty behavior. She was overcompensating because she knew what was coming. But I was too in love and too stupid to see the signs. I actually thought we'd turned a corner and our relationship was stronger than ever. The night everything exploded, Victoria had worked a late shift and came home around midnight. I was already in bed but woke up when I heard her crying in the bathroom. When I went to check on her, she had these bruises on her arms and a cut on her lip. She said she'd fallen down the hospital stairs and was embarrassed about being clumsy. I offered to take her to get checked out, but she said she was fine and just needed some ice. Looking back, Those bruises were perfectly positioned like someone had grabbed her arms during a struggle. The cut on her lip looked more like someone had hit her or she'd hit something while fighting. But I was thinking like a loving fiancé, not a detective. I took care of her, got her ice, made her tea, and held her until she fell asleep. She kept mumbling apologies in her sleep, saying she was sorry and that she never meant for things to go this far. I thought she was apologizing for worrying me about her fall, but now I know she was probably feeling guilty about what she was planning to do to me. That was the calm before the hurricane that would destroy my entire life. The next morning, Victoria left for work before I woke up, which was unusual because she normally made coffee for both of us. She left a note saying she had an early meeting and would call me later. That was the last normal morning we'd ever have together. 3 days later, I woke up to pounding on my front door at 6 in the morning. Victoria had already left for an early shift, so I stumbled to the door in my underwear thinking maybe it was an emergency. Instead, I found 2 police officers asking if I was Jake Morrison and if they could come inside to talk. They said they'd received a report of domestic violence and needed to ask me some questions. My brain couldn't even process what they were saying at first. Domestic violence? I'd never hurt Victoria or any woman in my life. I let them in because I figured there was some mistake and we'd clear it up quickly. The officers were professional but serious. Detective Rodriguez, the older one, did most of the talking while his partner took notes. They asked about my relationship with Victoria, if we'd been fighting recently, if I'd ever lost my temper with her. I answered honestly about the wedding stress and the arguments we'd been having, but I made it clear that I'd never laid a hand on her. Rodriguez asked specific questions about the night Victoria came home with bruises. Had we argued that night? Had I been drinking? Had I ever grabbed her arms or pushed her during an argument? Every question made it sound like they already believed I was guilty of something. They took notes and said they'd be in touch, but the way they looked at me made it clear they thought I was a wife beater. After they left, I called Victoria immediately. She didn't answer, so I left a message asking her to call me back because the police had come by asking strange questions. I went to work confused and worried, thinking maybe someone at the hospital had misunderstood something Victoria had said about our relationship. My boss pulled me aside around lunch and said he'd heard I might be having some personal problems. Word travels fast in a small town, and apparently someone had already told him about the police visit. He said he hoped everything worked out, but that the company had a zero-tolerance policy for domestic violence. I assured him it was all a misunderstanding, but I could tell he was already distancing himself from me. Victoria didn't return my calls all day. When I got home, she still wasn't there, but her car was in the driveway. I found her in our bedroom packing a suitcase with tears streaming down her face. When she saw me, she actually flinched and took a step back like she was afraid of me. She said she couldn't do this anymore and that she was going to stay with her sister for a while. When I asked what was wrong, she just kept saying she needed space and time to think. I tried to approach her to comfort her, but she backed away and told me not to touch her. The woman who'd been planning our wedding 3 days ago was acting like I was some kind of monster. I begged her to tell me what was happening. Had someone told her something about me? Was she having second thoughts about the wedding? She just kept crying and saying she was scared and needed to get away from me. When I asked if this was about the police visit, she said she'd told them the truth and couldn't live with the lies anymore. That's when it hit me that Victoria was the one who'd called the police. My own fiancé had accused me of domestic violence. I asked her directly if she'd reported me to the police, and she just looked at me with this expression I'd never seen before. It was like she was looking at a stranger, someone she despised. She left that night with 2 suitcases and didn't say goodbye. I called everyone trying to figure out what was happening. Her sister wouldn't take my calls. My mom said Victoria had called her crying, but wouldn't say what was wrong. Even Lucas wasn't answering his phone, which should have been another red flag, but I was too panicked to think straight. The next morning, the police came back with a warrant for my arrest. Victoria had filed a formal complaint claiming I'd been physically abusing her for months, and that the night she came home with bruises, I'd hit her because she was threatening to leave me. She had photographs of her injuries, a medical report from the hospital where she worked, and witness statements from co-workers who said she'd been acting scared and withdrawn lately. Detective Rodriguez read me my rights while I stood there in shock, trying to process how my life had just imploded. They were surprisingly gentle about it, probably because I was cooperating and obviously confused, but I still ended up in handcuffs in the back of a police car. The booking process was a nightmare. Fingerprints, photos, paperwork, sitting in a holding cell with guys who'd been arrested for everything from drunk driving to armed robbery. My bail was set at $50,000 because domestic violence cases are taken seriously, and I couldn't afford it because all my money was tied up in wedding expenses and the house down payment. The court-appointed attorney was a tired-looking guy named Peterson who had about 15 minutes to spend with me before my first hearing. He looked at the evidence against me and basically said I should consider pleading guilty to a reduced charge because Victoria's story was detailed and consistent. She had medical documentation, and domestic violence cases were hard to win. Peterson showed me Victoria's statement to police. She claimed I'd been controlling and jealous throughout our relationship, monitoring her phone calls and following her to work. She said the abuse had escalated in recent weeks as the wedding approached, and that I'd threatened to kill her if she tried to leave me. According to her statement, I'd grabbed her by the arms and slapped her the night she came home with bruises, all because she'd mentioned postponing the wedding. But I knew I was innocent. I'd never hurt Victoria, never even raised my voice at her in anger. The problem was proving it when she had physical evidence, and I had nothing but my word. The judge set a trial date 3 months away, and I was stuck in county jail because I couldn't make bail. That's when the real hell began. In jail, everyone knows what you're in for, and guys who beat women are right above child molesters on the hierarchy of who gets their ass kicked. I had to learn how to survive in there while trying to figure out how to prove my innocence from behind bars. My first week in jail, I got jumped by 3 guys who decided to teach the woman beater a lesson. I ended up with a black eye and cracked ribs, but the guards just said I'd probably fallen down some stairs. Welcome to the justice system, where you're guilty until proven innocent if you're accused of hitting a woman. County jail is no place for someone who's never been in trouble before. I spent my days trying to stay out of trouble and my nights lying awake wondering how Victoria could do this to me. Peterson visited me twice in 3 months and basically told me to prepare for prison time because Victoria's case was bulletproof. The wedding date came and went while I was locked up. I heard from my mom that Victoria had told everyone I'd snapped under the pressure and become violent. She was playing the victim perfectly, getting sympathy from our friends and family while I rotted in jail. Even some of my own relatives started believing maybe there was truth to her story, because why would she make something like that up? My cellmate was a guy named Rico who was in for check fraud. Smart guy, used to work in accounting before he got caught embezzling. He listened to my story and said something didn't add up about the timing. Why would Victoria file charges so close to the wedding if the abuse had been going on for months? Why didn't she leave earlier? Why didn't anyone else ever see signs of abuse? Rico had been through the system before and knew how these cases worked. He said most real domestic violence victims don't suddenly decide to press charges right before their wedding unless something major happened to push them over the edge. But according to Victoria's story, I'd been abusing her for months, which meant she'd been planning to marry her abuser. That didn't make psychological sense. Rico also pointed out that Victoria's injuries were suspicious. Real domestic violence usually shows a pattern of escalating abuse, but Victoria only had bruises from one incident. Most abusers don't suddenly start hitting their partners right before the wedding after years of a normal relationship. The timing was too convenient. I was losing hope until my mom visited me in month 4 and told me something interesting. Lucas had broken up with his girlfriend Amy about a week after my arrest, and Amy was going around town telling people that Lucas was a cheating scumbag who destroyed his own brother's life. She was apparently drunk at a bar one night, screaming about how she knew the truth and how some people would get what they deserved. That got my attention. I asked Mom to find Amy and see if she'd talk to her, but Amy had apparently left town right after the breakup. Nobody knew where she went, but she'd been posting cryptic messages on social media about knowing the truth and having evidence that would blow everyone's minds. I convinced Peterson to try to track down Amy as a potential witness, but he said he didn't have resources for that kind of investigation. The public defender's office was overworked and underfunded, and Peterson was juggling 30 other cases. I was screwed unless I could find Amy myself, which was pretty hard to do from a jail cell. That's when Rico suggested I write to every Amy Henderson in the state through the prison mail system. Long shot, but what else did I have? I spent weeks writing letters explaining who I was and asking if they knew anything about my case. Most went unanswered, but I kept trying because it was the only hope I had left. 3 weeks later, I got a response that changed everything. Amy had moved 2 states over to live with her cousin, but she'd been following my case online and waiting for someone to reach out to her. She said she'd been scared to come forward because Lucas had threatened her, but seeing me in jail for something I didn't do had been eating at her conscience. Her letter was 8 pages long, and it told me everything I needed to know. Victoria and Lucas had been having an affair for over a year. Amy had discovered it by accident when she found Victoria's earring in Lucas's truck and confronted him about it. Lucas confessed everything and begged Amy not to tell me because he was trying to end it with Victoria. But Victoria wasn't going to let Lucas go that easily. She'd become obsessed with him and was threatening to destroy his life if he didn't leave Amy and run away with her. When Lucas refused and said he was going to confess everything to me himself, Victoria panicked. She knew if the truth came out, she'd lose everything. Me, the house, the life we'd built together, and the respect of everyone who knew us. Amy's letter included copies of text messages between Victoria and Lucas that she'd screenshotted before Lucas made her delete them from her phone. The messages showed Victoria threatening Lucas, talking about her plan to frame me for domestic violence, and even discussing how she'd inflicted the injuries on herself to make her story believable. One text message from Victoria to Lucas was particularly damning. "If you don't choose me, I'll make sure your brother goes to prison for something he didn't do. I know exactly how to play the victim, and everyone will believe me over him." Another message showed Victoria asking Lucas to help her create believable injuries, and Lucas refusing and begging her not to go through with her plan. The most damning evidence was a voice recording Amy had made during a confrontation with Victoria after my arrest. Amy had been suspicious about the timing of everything and had secretly recorded a conversation where she confronted Victoria about the abuse allegations. Victoria actually admitted on tape that she'd made up the abuse allegations because she needed to get away from me without looking like the bad guy. In the recording, Victoria said she'd never intended for me to go to jail for so long, but once the legal process started, she couldn't back down without admitting she'd lied. She said everyone would feel sorry for her and blame me for the failed relationship, and eventually the charges would probably get reduced to something minor. I immediately shared everything with Peterson, who suddenly became very interested in my case. He'd been sleepwalking through my defense until he saw Amy's evidence, but now he realized he had a bombshell that could blow up the prosecution's case. He filed motions to get me released on bail pending a new investigation, and within a week I was out of jail for the first time in 5 months. The district attorney reviewed Amy's evidence and called for an immediate investigation into Victoria's allegations. They brought Victoria in for questioning, but she stuck to her story even when confronted with the text messages and voice recording. Her lawyer advised her to maintain her position and claimed that Amy had fabricated the evidence to help me, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The text messages had been verified as authentic by digital forensics experts, and the voice recording had been analyzed by audio specialists who confirmed it hadn't been altered. When faced with the possibility of perjury charges, Victoria finally cracked and admitted she'd made up the domestic violence allegations. The district attorney dropped all charges against me, but by then the damage to my reputation was already done. I'd spent 5 months in jail for a crime I didn't commit, lost my job, and nearly lost my house. Victoria had destroyed my life with her lies, but she was about to learn that actions have consequences. Getting out of jail should have felt like victory, but it was more like stepping into the ruins of my former life. Victoria had moved out of our house and taken half of everything, claiming it was compensation for the trauma I'd caused her. She'd kept her job at the hospital and was still playing the victim role to anyone who'd listen, even after the charges against me were dropped. The hospital administration was furious when they learned that one of their nurses had fabricated domestic violence allegations and used her medical knowledge to create fake evidence. Victoria was suspended pending an internal investigation, but she hired a lawyer and was fighting to keep her job. Lucas had disappeared completely after my arrest. My mom said he'd quit his construction job and left town without telling anyone where he was going. Probably figured he'd face less heat somewhere else once the truth came out. Amy's evidence had exposed the affair and the framed job, but Lucas was long gone by then. I hired a real attorney named Thompson who specialized in civil litigation and defamation cases. He looked at Amy's evidence and said I had grounds for several lawsuits against Victoria: false imprisonment, defamation, fraud, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and malicious prosecution. He also said we could potentially sue the hospital if they'd helped Victoria create false medical records. Thompson explained that proving the case would be easier now that the criminal charges were dropped and I had Amy's evidence. He said we could go after Victoria for damages related to my lost job, legal expenses, damage to my reputation, emotional suffering, and the financial losses from the canceled wedding. The fact that she'd used the legal system to falsely imprison me made the case even stronger. The first lawsuit we filed was for defamation and fraud. Victoria's lies had cost me my job because my employer couldn't keep someone on staff who'd been arrested for domestic violence, even though the charges were eventually dropped. I'd lost income, had to sell my car to pay legal expenses, and was facing foreclosure on the house because I couldn't make mortgage payments from jail. Victoria tried to fight it at first. She hired her own lawyer and claimed she'd been genuinely afraid of me and believed I was abusive. But Amy's recordings made that defense impossible to maintain. You can't claim you were afraid of someone when you're on tape admitting you made up the whole story to frame them. The discovery process revealed even more damning evidence. Victoria's phone records showed she'd been in contact with Lucas on the day she came home with the mysterious bruises. Hospital security footage showed Victoria leaving work at her normal time that day, contradicting her story about working late. Most shocking of all, The medical records she'd used to document her injuries had been falsified using her access to the hospital's computer system. Amy agreed to testify in the civil case and flew back to town for her deposition. She brought additional evidence she'd been holding back, including photographs of Lucas and Victoria together at a hotel, credit card receipts showing Victoria had paid for the hotel room herself, and more text messages where Victoria discussed her plan to frame me. The civil trial was everything the criminal case should have been. Thompson presented Amy's evidence, brought in character witnesses who testified about my reputation, and showed documentation of all the financial and personal damage Victoria's lies had caused. Victoria's lawyer tried to paint her as a confused woman who'd made mistakes while under emotional stress, but the jury wasn't buying it. Victoria took the stand and tried to maintain that she'd been genuinely afraid of me, but under cross-examination she fell apart. Thompson methodically walked her through every lie she'd told, every piece of evidence she'd fabricated, and every person she'd manipulated. By the end of her testimony, she was crying and admitting that she'd made terrible mistakes, but claiming she never intended for things to go so far. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before finding in my favor on all counts. The judgment was substantial: $200,000 in compensatory damages for lost wages, legal fees, and other expenses, plus another $300,000 in punitive damages because Victoria's actions were so deliberately cruel and calculating. Thompson also got an order requiring Victoria to publicly retract her statements about me and admit she'd made false accusations. But money wasn't enough. I wanted Victoria to face criminal consequences for what she'd done to me. So Thompson worked with the district attorney to file charges against her for perjury, filing false police reports, fraud, and obstruction of justice. The criminal case moved quickly because we had so much evidence, and Victoria's lawyer advised her to accept a plea deal rather than risk a longer sentence at trial. Victoria ended up pleading guilty to multiple felony charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison plus 3 years of probation. The judge said he was being lenient because she was a first-time offender, but he made it clear that false accusations of domestic violence were serious crimes that hurt real victims and clog up the legal system with lies. The hospital fired Victoria immediately after her criminal conviction and reported her to the state nursing board. She lost her nursing license permanently because of the felony conviction and the fact that she'd used her medical access to create false evidence. Her entire career was destroyed, and she'd never be able to work in healthcare again. Amy became an unexpected ally through the whole legal process. She testified in both the civil and criminal cases against Victoria, and we stayed in touch afterward. She said she felt guilty for not speaking up sooner, but I understood why she'd been scared. Victoria had threatened her too, and Amy had been trying to protect herself and her family from retaliation. The house went into foreclosure during my legal troubles, but I was able to buy it back with part of the settlement money. I got my job back after my employer realized they'd fired me based on false charges, and they even gave me back pay for the time I'd missed. My reputation in the community was slowly recovering as people learned the truth about what Victoria had done. Lucas never came back to town, but I heard through family that he'd found work in another state and was trying to rebuild his life. I never spoke to him again after everything that happened. Some betrayals are too deep to forgive, even from family. My mom tried to get me to reconcile with him, saying he'd been manipulated by Victoria too, but I couldn't get past the fact that he'd been willing to let me marry a woman he'd been sleeping with for over a year. Victoria got out of prison after serving 14 months and moved to another state to live with relatives. I heard she tried to get work as a waitress, but was fired when her background check revealed her criminal record. The felony conviction followed her everywhere, making it nearly impossible to find decent employment. These days, I'm rebuilding my life one piece at a time. I don't trust people as easily as I used to, and I definitely don't rush into relationships anymore. The experience taught me that even people you love completely can be capable of unimaginable betrayal when they're desperate enough or feel cornered. I eventually started dating again about 2 years after everything was settled. I met a woman named Karen through friends who knew my whole story and didn't judge me for it. She understood why I was cautious about commitment and was patient with my trust issues. We took things slow, and I made sure to pay attention to red flags I'd missed with Victoria. The whole experience lasted almost 3 years from start to finish. 3 years of my life destroyed because the woman I loved decided it was easier to frame me for domestic violence than admit she'd been cheating with my brother. But in the end, the truth came out, justice was served, and I got to rebuild my life while she lost everything she'd tried so hard to protect. The settlement money helped me get back on my feet, but the real victory was clearing my name and proving that I wasn't the monster Victoria had painted me to be. I learned that the legal system isn't perfect, but sometimes it does work if you have enough evidence and the right attorney fighting for you. Victoria's life became a cautionary tale in our small town about what happens when you try to destroy someone with lies. Her family disowned her after learning the truth. Her friends abandoned her, and she ended up with nothing but a criminal record and a reputation as someone who couldn't be trusted. The consequences of her actions followed her just like she'd intended them to follow me. And that's the story. If you're still here, that means you're one of us. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button. I drop new chaos every single day, and trust me, tomorrow's story, it's even worse than this one.